The twin suns of Laressa blazed over the vast desert plains of Harmonia, the capital settlement. Nick Sanders wiped sweat from his brow as the harsh morning light glinted off crystalline structures that rose like mirages from the endless dunes. His boots sank slightly into the fine purple sand as he stepped out of the climate-controlled Earth Embassy compound. "Authorized personnel only beyond this point, Mr. Sanders." His wrist communicator beeped with Ambassador Kessler's pre-recorded warning. Nick tapped the device to silence it. "Tell that to my sand-clogged air filters," he muttered. After 3 nights of hearing the howling desert winds against his quarters, Nick had abandoned his bunk at first light, determined to see the real Laressa. The alien settlement was a marvel of adaptation. Crystalline spires somehow anchored themselves in the shifting sands, while bioluminescent desert plants provided natural light and protection against sandstorms. As an engineer, Nick's mind raced with questions about their survival techniques. He'd never understood diplomats who visited alien worlds and stayed hidden in Earth-like bubbles. What was the point? His translator implant hummed as he passed 2 violet-skinned locals in flowing sand-resistant robes. Their conversation, filtered through the device, came through with a slight delay. After the first sun rises, the breaking of harmony is severe, deservedly so. She knew exactly what she was doing. Nick paused, adjusting his implant. The translation was good, but the meaning was unclear. Something about punishment, maybe. A crowd was gathering nearby, flowing toward a central plaza carved into the desert floor. Nick followed, telling himself it was pure anthropological curiosity, nothing to do with avoiding his morning meetings. The crowd gathered in a vast circular depression, surrounded by unadorned walls of compacted earth and a raised obsidian platform at the center that shimmered with heat. "Excuse me," Nick said, tapping the shoulder of a shorter Laressian. The alien turned to him with wide golden eyes. "Off-worlder!" it hissed, pulling its sand veil tighter before stepping away. "Friendly bunch," Nick muttered. He'd been briefed on Laressian xenophobia, but the diplomatic files had emphasized their philosophical sophistication and desert survival skills, not their apparent distaste for foreigners. The crowd parted momentarily, revealing a woman kneeling at the center of the platform, her wrists bound to a post with silver chains that glinted in the harsh light. Her skin was a deep violet, almost midnight blue in the heat waves. She raised her chin, and her eyes flashed silver. Nick recognized her extraordinary beauty, not just by human standards, but with a kind of cross-species perfection that made his heart race. "Who is that?" he asked a nearby bystander, but the person shuffled away without answering. A chime rang through the plaza, signaling the start of the ritual. The murmuring crowd fell silent as 3 robed figures ascended to the platform. The central figure, a woman with elaborate hair decorations and a thin veil, stepped forward. "Elira Selmarin," she announced, her voice carrying across the sand. "You stand condemned for breaking harmony by willfully disrupting the natural order." Nick's translator struggled with some of the phrases, but the malicious satisfaction in the speaker's tone needed no translation. "Would the accused speak before purification begins?" asked one of the other robed figures. The bound woman, Era, lifted her head. "I have broken no harmony, Verica, as you well know," she said clearly, despite the harsh desert air. A unless refusing your brother makes me guilty." The crowd rippled with murmurs. Verica, the central accuser, stepped forward and struck Aira across the face. "The breaking is confirmed by your prideful denial," she announced. "Let the shame cleanse what reason cannot." Verica turned to the crowd, her arms outstretched. "Who brings the first purification?" An older male stepped forward, holding what looked like a dry desert branch. He threw it at Aira, hitting her shoulder with a sharp crack. Nick watched in horror as more people stepped forward, each throwing sticks or handfuls of sand at the bound woman. Aira never flinched, never cried out, though her white garment was now streaked with dust and small tears where the projectiles struck. "Jesus Christ!" Nick muttered, horrified. His diplomatic briefing had covered Loresian agriculture, water conservation, and energy protocols, but not public torture rituals. A young male approached, carrying something larger than the others, a jagged rock. Nick's stomach twisted as the man's intentions became clear. "For the harmony you broke in my household," the man shouted, "when you refused to accept your proper place." He hurled the stone with vicious force, hitting Aira's cheek and drawing a stream of shimmering silver blood. The blood evaporated almost instantly in the desert heat. Something inside Nick snapped. He'd seen enough. "Stop!" he bellowed, shoving through the crowd. His larger human frame parted the Loresians as he charged toward the platform. "What the hell is wrong with all of you?" A stick meant for Aira struck Nick across the back as he vaulted onto the obsidian stage, positioning himself between her and her tormentors. The crowd froze in shock. The silence was absolute, except for the whisper of sand shifting in the breeze. Nick turned to Aira, getting his first close view of her face. The silver blood trickled down her perfect features, crystallizing in the desert air. But her deep, indigo eyes now locked onto his. "Are you insane?" she whispered, her translator struggling with the dialect. "Leave the platform immediately." "Not while they're treating you like this," Nick replied, turning to face the crowd. "I don't know what passes for justice in your philosophy books, but where I come from, we don't stone women in public squares." The oldest of the robed figures stepped forward cautiously, sand crunching beneath his boots. "Off-worlder," he said in halting English, dismissing his translator with a wave. "You have invoked Tenkavos." "I've invoked common decency," Nick shot back. The elder's golden eyes narrowed beneath his veil. "Burden-sharing law, ancient and sacred," he began. "By receiving the punishment meant for the harmony breaker, you become responsible for purification." Nick blinked, feeling grit in his eyes. "What?" Behind him, Aira made a small, hopeless sound. "Oh, fool," she murmured. "You've claimed me." Verica stepped forward, her anger twisting her features. "The off-worlder has invoked Tenkavos," she said, her lips curling into a cruel smile. "He must now complete the punishment himself, or take the breaker into his custody for purification through devotion." Nick's translator struggled with the complex cultural context, but provided enough for him to understand the horrific choice. Torture her himself, or become her jailer, keeper, and potentially her executioner, should she fail to be cleansed. "I'll take custody," he said firmly, without hesitation. The elder nodded solemnly, gesturing for one of the robed figures to approach with a key. As the silver chains fell away, Nick saw the bruises forming on Aira's violet skin. The cut on her cheek continued to bleed silver blood that glittered strangely in the sunlight. He offered his hand. Aira stared at it, then at him, her indigo eyes swirling with conflicting emotions. "Why?" she asked simply. "Because it's wrong," Nick answered, his voice firm. "And where I come from, we don't stand by watching wrong things happen." A flicker of something, hope, skepticism, crossed her face before she took his hand and rose to her feet. Despite her ordeal, she moved with fluid grace, standing just shy of Nick's shoulder. "Your name, off-worlder?" she asked. "Nick Sanders." "Remember it well, Nick Sanders," she replied coolly. "You've just shackled yourself to a stranger's fate in a desert that devours the unprepared." The crowd parted as Nick guided her toward the plaza's edge. He could feel hundreds of alien eyes burning into his back. Whispers echoed around them, some making strange gestures as they passed. "They're warding off disharmony," Aira explained. "I'm considered contagious until cleansed, like a poison in the water supply." "This is insane," Nick said, shielding his eyes from the increasing glare of the twin suns. "What happened to the advanced philosophical society I read about?" A laugh held no humour. "Those texts are ancient history. Laressa hasn't been that world for generations. Not since the great sandstorms. Now, we preserve only the forms of philosophy while practicing its shadow, just as we preserve the forms of civilization while the desert reclaims everything." They reached a modest dwelling at the edge of the diplomatic quarter, Nick's temporary housing, partially buried in sand for natural insulation. "Home sweet home," he said, waving his hand over the entry panel. The door slid open, releasing a blast of cooler air. "It's not much, but it's better than an obsidian post in the sun," Nick added. Aira hesitated at the threshold, sand swirling around her feet. "Once I enter, the bond is formalized," she warned. "Not really," Nick admitted, "but I'm getting the distinct impression I've stepped into something a lot deeper than desert quicksand." She studied him carefully. "You truly don't know what you've done, do you? By invoking Tenkavos, you've claimed responsibility for my purification. Until I'm declared cleansed, we are bound together. You cannot leave this planet. You cannot transfer the obligation. My actions become your responsibility. My failures, your shame." "You should have let them take me," she said quietly, her voice carrying a note of resignation. "You don't understand what you've committed to." Nick turned to face her. The dwelling's artificial light made her violet skin glow, almost ethereal. The cut on her cheek had stopped bleeding, but left behind a silvery trace, like metallic war paint. "Then explain it to me," Nick replied, a hint of frustration in his voice. "What does being your purifier really mean?" Aya stood, her movements smooth and graceful. "First, we cleanse the dwelling. Your home must be prepared for one who has broken harmony." Nick watched as she pulled a small bag from her torn garment. Inside were tiny grains of crystallized sand, glowing faintly with an inner light. "Desert tears," she said. "They absorb disharmony." Nick stood intrigued as she scattered the shimmering sand around the dwelling's corners. As the grains settled, they pulsed gently, like a heartbeat. "Second," Aya continued, "the breaker must be cleansed. I need water. Nick gestured toward the hygiene unit. The shower's in there. 4-minute limit to conserve water, but that's not the type of cleansing, is it? Aya's lips quirked. Ritual cleansing. You must pour the water. Nick blinked. Wait, I have to bathe you? Aya's indigo eyes sparkled with amusement. Does that disturb your earthly sensibilities, Nick Sanders? Nick hesitated, realizing the trap. If he admitted discomfort, he'd show weakness. If he acted too eager, she'd suspect his motives. I just want to make sure I understand the ritual properly. Aya's lips curved slightly. A diplomatic response. Fill this, she gestured to a ceramic basin, with exactly 16 measures of water. No more, no less. Nick carefully measured the water into the basin. Aya disappeared into the hygiene unit and returned shortly afterward, draped in a thin, translucent shift. Nick nearly dropped the water measure. Jesus, he muttered. Is something wrong? Aya's voice was innocent, but her eyes challenged him. All good, just not what I expected. Nick carefully set the basin down, focusing on her face. So, what do I do? Kneel, she instructed. Wash away the marks of breaking. Nick knelt before her, dipping his hands into the cool water. He began gently cleaning the dirt and silver blood from her face, neck, and arms. Her skin felt like silk beneath his fingertips, radiating warmth. Your hands are gentle for a species that claims so many stars, Aya observed, watching him closely. We're not all conquerors, Nick replied, focusing on a particularly stubborn smudge on her shoulder instead of the fabric clinging to her curves. Some of us just fix things. Is that what you're doing with me? Fixing? Nick looked up, meeting her gaze. No, I'm righting a wrong. There's a difference. A subtle change flickered in Aya's eyes, a softening. The water turned silver, she said, glancing at the basin. It absorbs the breaking. Nick looked down, noticing that the clear water had developed a metallic sheen, as though her silver blood had dissolved into it. What happens next? He asked, standing and drying his hands. Now we wait. The council will send notification of the first purification trial by morning. Aya glanced around the small dwelling. Where shall I sleep? Nick pointed to the single sleeping platform. You take the bed. I'll use the floor cushions. Aya raised an eyebrow. That's unexpected. As purifier, the sleeping arrangement is yours to command. Nick's voice was firm. Yeah, well, this purifier doesn't command sleeping arrangements with people who've just been through trauma. Get some rest. He arranged the cushions on the floor, while Aya observed him silently. You are strange, Nick Sanders, she finally said. I can't decide if you're foolish or something else entirely. Story of my life, Nick muttered, settling onto his makeshift bed. Get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. The first test came at dawn. A Loresian official arrived carrying a sealed scroll and a box of fine sand. The ritual required Nick to create a small sculpture from the sand, representing his understanding of harmony. His hands were steady, but his knowledge of Loresian aesthetics was non-existent. It's a test designed for failure, Aya whispered as Nick struggled. The sandcraft is meant to reveal your inner disharmony. Nick frowned at his lopsided spiral. Got any tips? Aya couldn't help but smile softly. I can't help directly, but true harmony flows like water through stone. Taking her hint, Nick abandoned his rigid approach and let the sand flow between his fingers more naturally. The resulting shape resembled a wave breaking on the shore, fluid and balanced, though not traditional Loresian design. The official studied it, eyes narrowing, then made a notation on the scroll. "Acceptable?" he said reluctantly. First trial. Passed. 6 more trials followed over the next 3 days, each testing Nick's commitment to Elra's purification. He recited Loresian philosophy, stood motionless in the desert sun while balancing a water vessel, and defended his actions before a minor council. In between trials, they spent hours in the dwelling. Aya's behavior became increasingly perplexing, dropping things and bending provocatively to retrieve them, asking intrusive questions about human mating habits, and emerging from the hygiene unit in progressively less clothing, explaining each time that it was part of the purification process. Nick grew uncomfortable. "Is this really a requirement of your cleansing?" Aya paused mid-dance on the 4th evening, her violet skin glistening. "Do you find me uncomfortable?" Nick hesitated. "I find your games uncomfortable. You're testing me, waiting for me to act like the monster you think I am." Aya straightened, abandoning the ritual pretense. "Is it so wrong to test the cage before trusting the keeper?" "I'm not your keeper," Nick shot back. "Legally, you are exactly that." Nick ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "Look, I get it. You have no reason to trust me. But these little provocations aren't helping either of us." Aya studied him thoughtfully. Most men would have taken advantage by now. Purifiers traditionally have complete control over those they cleanse. The historic texts are clear. "I'm not most men," Nick said firmly. "And I'm definitely not a traditional purifier. I'm just a guy who couldn't watch someone be abused." Nick sighed. "Can we start over? Actually talk instead of you setting traps and me trying not to fall into them?" Aya fell silent, then nodded. "What would you like to know, Nick Sanders?" "Everything," he replied. "Why were you really condemned? What happens if these trials fail? How did Loressa end up with these brutal customs?" Aya settled onto a cushion, her expression shifting from guarded to contemplative. "Loressa was once different. The ancient texts speak of gardens across the dunes, philosophers debating beneath crystal domes. Then came the great sandstorms, decades of environmental collapse that nearly destroyed our civilization." She traced patterns in the sand. When resources dwindled, so did compassion. The philosophy of harmony became a tool to maintain order. Those who challenged authority were labeled breakers and publicly shamed, preserving the hierarchy while giving the masses an outlet for their fear and anger. Nick was beginning to understand. "And you became a target?" Aya nodded. "I create beauty that reminds people of what we've lost." For the first time, genuine emotion colored her voice. "I sculpt sand into forms that capture water and nurture life. Practical art that challenges the Council's narrative that Loressa must remain barren, except where they allow growth. My work gained followers. People started creating their own micro-gardens that didn't depend on Council water rations. Kratos took an interest in my work and then in me. When I refused his advances, the breaking judgment followed swiftly." Nick's heart clenched. This was never about harmony. It was about control, about silencing innovation. Aya met his gaze, and removing a woman who dared say no to power, their conversation continued late into the night, with Nick describing Earth's environmental struggles and the fight against authoritarianism, while Aya explained Loresian art forms and the resistance hidden in their patterns. The next day, the greatest challenge arrived. A senior council member brought a scroll bearing Elder Jen's official seal. The purifier must publicly discipline the breaker before cleansing could proceed. Aya's face turned ashen. "This is Vera's doing," she whispered. Nick's stomach tightened. "Absolutely not." Aya explained that refusing the discipline would result in the purification failing, and she would become twice broken. Nick paced. "There has to be another way, some loophole, some alternative interpretation." Aya's voice was tight. "There isn't. This system is designed to perpetuate shame, not dispel it." Frustrated, Nick slammed his fist against the wall, sending sand cascading from the ceiling. "I won't hurt you. I won't drag you back to that plaza. If you refuse, they'll separate us. Everything you've endured will be for nothing," Aya said, stepping closer. Then a message arrived. Nick's team was ready to extract him, but Nick wasn't ready to leave yet. There was still too much at stake. Aya's tracking implant ensured her bond to Loressa. But Nick saw a way to get them both out. "Let's leave," he decided. "I have a sand skimmer. It can get us." "Does everything always look this intense on Loressa?" Nick asked, blinking rapidly. "Only when you're about to fight for your life," Elra replied, but the lightness in her voice didn't hide the tension in her shoulders. "Nick, there's something you should know before we begin. The staffs will be. Using don't just cause pain, they reveal truth." "Meaning?" he asked. "And personally?" Elra glanced back at the gathering of Loresians who had come to witness their departure, including Elder Sorin and, surprisingly, Elder Jen himself. "Loressa is changing," she said. "The trial of shared fate has been invoked 17 times since our combat. The breaking judgments are being reviewed, but change takes time." Nick finished for her. "And it needs to come from within." "Yes, which is why I will return eventually." Her hand found his, soul light briefly flickering beneath both their skins. At the contact, a permanent side effect of the combat serum, according to Sorin. "But first," Elra continued, "I believe I owe my purifier a proper education in Loresian art forms on, meaning that in the heat of combat, when adrenaline and the serum mix, your deepest feelings become visible through your skin, like bioluminescence. The Loresians call it soul light." She hesitated, then added, "It's why the trial of shared. Fate is considered definitive. You can't fake devotion when the staffs activate." Nick processed the information, wondering what truths his skin might betray. Before he could respond, a gong reverberated through the crystal chamber, vibrating through his teeth. "Time," Elder Sorin announced solemnly. "Enter and be judged." They stepped into the arena together. The acoustics of the chamber amplified the crowd's murmur into a disorienting wave that hit Nick's heightened senses. At the center of the perfect circle stood Vera Andratos, already holding her ritual staff, an elegant crystalline rod pulsing with internal energy. Elder Jen occupied a raised platform, his ceremonial robes glittering with embedded sand crystals. Around him sat the full council, their expressions ranging from fascination to open hostility. "Approach!" Jen commanded, his amplified voice echoing through the chamber. Nick and Elra walked forward, their footsteps synchronized without conscious effort. 4 ritual staffs stood embedded in a sandstone block at the arena's center. "Detish, ancient trial of Tenkavossashar has been invoked," Jen announced to the crowd. "The Purifier and the Breaking One seek to prove mutual devotion through the willingness to bear each other's burdens." He turned his golden gaze to Nick. "Off-worlder, do you understand that failure in this trial condemns both of you, and victory requires both combatants to succeed?" "I understand," Nick replied. "And you, Era Selma, Breaking One. Do you understand that this trial may end in your permanent exile should you fail to demonstrate true devotion?" Elra stood taller. "I understand." Elder Jen gestured to the staffs. "Then begin. The accusers face those they accused. Victory comes only when both opponents are disarmed. But beware, killing is forbidden. Disharmony will result in immediate condemnation." Nick reached for a staff, surprised by its lightness. The crystal vibrated against his palm, almost hungry for contact. Across from him, Kratos smiled coldly, twirling his staff with practiced ease. "The human thinks he can master Loresian combat." Kratos sneered loud enough for the crowd to hear. "I will educate you before I reclaim what is rightfully mine." Nick said nothing, remembering his Krav Maga instructor's first lesson. Let them talk. Every word is wasted breath. At Jen's signal, combat began. Kratos attacked immediately, his staff whirling in complex patterns that forced Nick into desperate defense. Each strike sent painful energy pulses up Nick's arms. His Earth combat training had prepared him for direct confrontation. Not this dance of crystalline weapons and energy discharges. Through his peripheral vision, he saw Elra and Vera engaged in their own deadly choreography. Elra moved with unexpected grace, her smaller stature allowing her to evade Vera's more powerful strikes. "You fight like a sand scavenger," Kratos taunted, pressing his advantage and driving Nick back toward the arena wall. Desperate and graceless, Nick grunted as a particularly vicious strike hit his shoulder, sending a paralyzing jolt through his left arm. The staff nearly slipped from his grasp. "And you fight like someone who's never faced an opponent who fights back," Nick countered, switching tactics. Instead of meeting Kratos' elaborate flourishes, he began fighting Earth-style, direct, efficient, unpredictable. Surprise flickered across Kratos' face as Nick suddenly closed the distance rather than retreating. A quick feint left, then a sweeping low strike nearly connected with the Loresian's knees. "She was never yours to claim," Nick growled, pressing his advantage. "People aren't possessions," says the man who invoked Purifier rights. Kratos shot back, recovering his stance. To protect her, not own her. Their staffs connected with a crack, sending crystalline fragments flying. The crowd gasped as energy discharged, invisible arcs between the weapons across the arena. Vera had gained the upper hand against Elra, driving her toward the center with increasingly vicious strikes. One hit Elra's side, sending her to one knee with a cry that cut through Nick's concentration. Kratos seized the opening, sweeping Nick's feet out from under him. He crashed hard onto the sand-covered floor, his staff skittering from his grasp. Kratos' weapon pressed against his chest, painful energy pulsing through his sternum. As I predicted," Kratos announced triumphantly to the crowd. "The off-worlder lacks the discipline." His victory speech was cut short as a violent blur interposed itself between them. Elra had abandoned her own fight, throwing herself between Nick and the final blow, a mirror image of his earlier intervention in the Plaza of Shame. The staff struck her squarely across the back, but instead of crying out, she remained still, eyes locked with Nick's. Then it happened. Light bloomed beneath her violet skin, not the silver of her blood, but a warm golden radiance that pulsed in time with her heartbeat. The soul light, visible now through the staff's energy and the combat serum. The crowd fell silent, transfixed by the unmistakable evidence of true devotion. "Protocol violation!" Vera shrieked, advancing with her staff raised. "The breaking! One has abandoned her designated combat." But her protest died as Nick rolled to his feet in a single fluid motion, retrieving his fallen staff. The movement brought him protectively in front of Elra, his back to Kratos. "Take my burden," he said, clearly speaking the ritual words without thought. "As I have taken yours." As he spoke, his own skin began to glow. Warm amber light pulsing through his human complexion, mimicking Elra's. The crowd's silence deepened with renewed focus. Nick turned to face Kratos again, his earlier clumsiness with the staff gone, replaced by a deeper understanding. The staff felt like an extension of himself, responding to intention rather than technique. Kratos attacked in desperation, his earlier confidence shattered by the visible evidence of mutual devotion. His strikes grew wild and predictable. Nick parried easily, then countered with a simple direct thrust that knocked Kratos' staff from his hands. The Loresian fell to his knees, defeat written across his features. Nick raised his staff for the finishing strike, then deliberately planted it in the sand beside his opponent. "Harmony doesn't come from domination," he announced, his voice carrying through the crystal chamber. "It comes from balance, from choice." Behind him, Elra had regained her footing with a series of swift, elegant movements. She disarmed the still protesting Vera, sending the woman's staff spinning into the air. When it clattered to the ground, Elra stood over it, but made no move to deliver a final strike. "True cleansing comes from choosing compassion when vengeance is possible," she declared, her voice steady despite the pain she must have been feeling. "I reject the breaking judgment and claim the ancient right of harmony through mutual truth." The soul light beneath their skin pulsed in perfect synchronization, casting golden reflections across the crystal walls. Nick extended his hand, and Elra took it, their fingers intertwining as they faced the Elder Council together. Elder Jen rose slowly, his expression unreadable. For a moment that stretched into eternity, he simply stared at them. Then, to the shock of the assembly, he descended from the platform and approached Elder Sarin, demanding the ancient texts. Sorin produced a scroll from his robes and unrolled it with reverent care. Jen studied it, then turned to the crowd. "It is written," he announced, "when protector and protected each bear, the other's burden willingly. When soul light reveals undisguised truth, the circle of purification is complete." The trial of shared fate has been satisfied. He turned to Nick and Elra. Eira Salmarin is declared cleansed. The off-worlder is released from obligation. The pronouncement hung in the air for a heartbeat before the crowd erupted, not in protest, as Nick had feared, but in a sound he took a moment to recognize. Awe. Many Loresians approached the council platform, speaking urgently to various elders. "What's happening?" Nick asked as the soul light gradually faded from their skin. "They're invoking their own trial," Elra explained, wonder in her voice. "Others who have been wrongfully condemned are claiming the right of shared fate." Ambassador Kessler pushed through the crowd, her diplomatic composure momentarily abandoned in favor of open astonishment. "Sanders, what the hell did you just do?" "Apparently," Nick replied with a tired smile, "I just participated in a cultural revolution." 3 days later, Nick stood at the boarding ramp of the Earth diplomatic vessel, watching the final preparations for departure. His mission on Loressa was complete. The water purification project successfully transferred to local engineers, with Elra's faction providing sustainable collection designs. "Are you sure about this?" he asked as Elra approached, now dressed in formal Loresian travelling robes. The silver tracking implant had been removed from her neck, leaving a small scar that would fade with time. "About leaving Loressa, or about coming with you?" she countered, amusement dancing in her now silver eyes. "Both, I guess." She stepped closer, close enough that he could smell the desert spice scent of her hair. "The Council has appointed me cultural ambassador to Earth, the first in our history. It would be politically awkward to refuse." "Very politically awkward," Nick agreed, fighting a smile.